Hello, everybody, and welcome to the From Poverty to Progress channel, the channel that is devoted to promoting an awareness and understanding of human progress. My name is Michael Magoon, and I am the author of the From Poverty to Progress book series. The first book in my book series is entitled From Poverty to Progress, and it explains the origin and causes of modern progress. My second book, which I'm excited to announce is now available on pre-release, is about applying those lessons, so how we can keep progress going, both in the United States, Western Europe, and in developing nations. Today I'm going to continue my series of reviews about books on the topics of progress, history, economic growth, and technological innovation. Today's episode is going to be about reviewing a brand new book entitled What's Our Problem? A Self-Help Book for Societies by Tim Urban. Now, if you haven't heard of Tim Urban, he's pretty well known for his blog called Wait, But Why? He's particularly known for his ability to use simple illustrations to explain very complicated ideas. So I'm going to do this book review a little bit different. Instead of having lots of quotes from the author, I'm going to show the illustrations and then paraphrase Tim Urban's quotes. Now, the author starts out by saying that there are two parts of the human brain, what he calls the primitive brain and the higher mind. Now, anybody who knows about basic psychology knows that this is well within what a lot of psychologists believe of how the human brain works. The primitive mind is the more emotional and non-rational part of the human brain, and the higher mind is the more rational part of the human brain. Tim Urban then goes on to show how there are different types of human thinking, or what he calls the ladder. At the top is when the higher mind is in control. At the bottom is when the primitive mind is in control. Now, he believes, and I agree with him, that all people are capable of being anywhere on this ladder, and they can change over time. So he makes the argument that we should all try and be as high on the ladder as we possibly can. And where it really gets interesting is when you start to have the different ladders of individuals and how they scale together to create very different types of societies. At the bottom, with the most emotional, is what he calls the zealots, the people who think almost totally based on emotion and wanting to be right. Then a little bit higher up is what he calls the attorney. These are people who are absolutely trying to win an argument, but they're trying to use rational arguments in order to advance that means. And then comes the sport fan. These are people who I'm not really sure if I'd consider a sports fan to be more rational than attorneys, but basically what he's saying is they're higher up on the type of thinking. And then at the very top is what Tim Urban believes most people should aspire to be, and that is the scientists. We have certain ideas. We consider those ideas to be plausible hypotheses to be tested out in society, particularly with discussions with other people. And doing so, we always keep an open mind. So Tim Urban makes the very interesting point that when you have lots of people who are acting like scientists, they group together to create what he calls a genie. In other words, we are bringing together the collective intelligence of the people in a way to help solve problems. But then on the other hand, if there's a lot of people who act as zealots and who only care about being right and winning the arguments, that creates an echo chamber that brings out the worst in human societies. And that creates what he calls a golem, a creature that is very powerful and is capable of great destruction, but is not capable of solving problems for society. So Tim Urban argues that we should stop thinking about politics based on left and right. What we should really be thinking about is golems versus genies, that regardless of whether you're on the left or the right, as long as you use the higher, rational, problem-solving part of the human brain, we can work collectively together, both left and right, arguing and eventually pushing the country forward towards a better society. But that very same left and right can also be turned into golems if too much of us are zealots and simply trying to win arguments. The result is bad for society overall. Tim Auburn's essential argument is that over the last 50 to 60 years, the two major parties have moved away from being genies that help to solve problems to becoming golems that help push the country backwards into conflict that solves no problems at all. Now, he makes the argument, a very interesting argument, that what he calls liberal societies, and here he means liberal as in classical liberal from the Enlightenment, not so much liberal versus conservative as Americans discuss it today. Liberalism is essentially gives the maximum sphere for rights and a minimal sphere for safety in the middle, that essentially you can do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt other people. And this leads to the maximum amount of freedom for the maximum number of people. In what I believe is one of his strongest points, he talks about what he calls the thought pile, which is kind of an abstract concept, but is essentially arraying the people's actual thoughts along a spectrum and then comparing that to what he calls the speech curve. In other words, how honest are people in being able to present their actual opinions as opposed to pretending to believe in something. Ideally, if you want a problem-solving society, you want people to be able to express their opinions so that their speech is an accurate reflection of their actual thoughts. And he points out that a healthy liberal society is based on three fundamental assumptions. At the top are norms, policies, laws, and institutions. And these are the things that most of us think about most of the time. But then at a deeper level, there's also certain fundamental assumptions of liberalism itself. In other words, free markets, free speech, individualism, equality of opportunity. The norms, policies, laws, and institutions rest on that solid foundation. And then finally, at the very bottom are the assumptions of modernity, which is essentially about science, reason, and objective truth. And Tim Urban points out that we have different levels of argumentation, that most of American discussions traditionally have been between what he calls progressive liberals and conservative liberals. In other words, the conservative liberals typically are the right and the progressive liberals typically are on the left. They essentially argue about what the norms, policies, laws, and institutions, and the left tends to want to change those to create a more just society, whereas the conservative liberals tend to want to preserve what we already have because it's too risky to try and make changes. He points out that while conservative liberals and progressive liberals agree on the concept of liberalism, there is another group of Marxists and neo-Marxists who disagree on that. So they have a fundamentally deeper level of conflict. This is about the role of liberalism itself, of free markets, free speech, individualism, and equality of opportunity. But despite those tremendous differences between Marxism and conservatives and progressives, all three sides still believe in the concept of modernity. In other words, science, reason, and objective truth. Now we get down to argumentation on the deepest level of all. Whereas conservative liberals, progressive liberals, and Marxists agree on modernity, the postmodernists don't. They believe that science, reason, and objective truth are itself means of oppression. And so they want to get rid of those assumptions in favor of true social justice. Now remember this illustration that Tim Urban had before about essentially the liberal assumptions that people can do what they want as long as they don't get inside the sphere of endangering other people. Well, the problem that he tries to identify is with what he calls social justice fundamentalism, which a lot of people think of as the woke or as critical theory. I personally prefer the term critical theory, but social justice fundamentalism is fine. He claims is that there is a concept creep in the concept of harm, that gradually the idea of harm is expanded out further and further with the concepts of, for example, microaggressions, cultural appropriation and such, actions and speech that most liberals would believe do not cause harm and therefore should be okay. The social justice fundamentalists believe this is causing harm. So they're effectively weaponizing the concept of harm and expanding it to such a great level as to justify censorship and oppression. And About a third of this book really is about critiquing social justice fundamentalism as fundamentally opposed to progressive liberalism. So whereas the liberal will say the harm line is relatively up high and people should be allowed to be doing whatever they want to, both by law and by social norms, the social justice fundamentalists expand the definition of harm so that less and less becomes allowable based on law and based on social norms. And this fundamentally undermines our liberty. Timmer then goes on to make the point that a lot of the concepts that are advanced by social justice fundamentalism are actually creating golems. They're essentially attempts to create safe spaces where social justice ideals cannot be challenged, and therefore they are creating golems that are attacking the rights of other people. For example, a safe space for students of color becomes a sacred space for the social justice fundamentalism narrative. An inclusive environment is an environment that punishes anyone who doesn't conform to our moral code. Academic justice is clamping down on wrongthink in academic research. And diversity statements are McCarthyist political litmus tests and loyalty oaths. So what the social justice fundamentalists have done is effectively expanding the concept of harm so far that they're able to create golems within American institutions, in particular on college campuses. As people's right to free speech gradually contracts, golems are created that end up taking over the entire institution and transforming an important institution for a liberal society that helps us solve problems into essentially a totalitarian regime. Tim Urban then says that there is effectively an illiberal staircase. That first, the woke focus on speech control, and then, in other words, shutting down people's freedom of speech. Then they require mandatory classes, which is essentially forced listening. And then they force people to speak up in favor. What you end up getting is a very wide divergency between what people think and what people say through the combination of censorship and forced speech. That a lot of times people will just go along with the social justice narrative, even if they don't agree with it, just to get along with other people. So then it appears like everybody agrees with the social justice narrative, and then it becomes very intimidating for other people. So what you get are tremendous differences between what people say and what people actually think, which ends up undermining the problem solving of first the institution, and then as it spreads from institution to society overall. So you can see here, combining the two representations. On the left is how we want things to be in a liberal society, where people are allowed to speak their minds, and so therefore the speech that people hear is relatively close to how people are actually thinking. But after the oppression of the social justice fundamentalists taking over institutions, what you get is a radical divergence between what people say and what people are actually thinking. And this fundamentally undermines the genies that enable society to solve problems over time. So what does this do, particularly in the campus environment? Well, this is a pretty interesting illustration right here of what Tim Urban calls the child's hill, where you're combining together knowledge on the x-axis and conviction on the y-axis. That essentially, when you're young, you think you know a lot. You actually know very little, but you're very strong in your convictions. What the universities are supposed to do is expose people to a wide variety of ideas, and so that they realize that they have no idea what they're talking about, that they actually know very little. And so they fall into the insecure canyon. And then in doing so, they start to really learn, where they actually acquire knowledge, and slowly their conviction grows back, but not based on assumptions of knowing everything. It's based on actual knowledge, and that's what we need over time, and that's exactly what the woke are sabotaging in universities. What are my ratings overall? Well, in terms of scope, I'd give it 4 stars. I think it goes into really good depth on the importance of freedom of speech and on liberal institutions and some of these social norms that they're based on. And I also would give it a 4 for theory for the exact same reason. Readability, well, here I give it a 5. I think it's unusual for a book to be as readable as this one. If you're interested in understanding the woke and understanding why they're a threat to society and how they work, this is a great book. Even if all you do is look at the illustrations, you'll get a lot from this book. So my personal ratings, I give it a 4.5. I think it's an excellent book. I would highly recommend it if you want to understand why free societies prosper and also why social justice fundamentalism is a threat both to society and progressive liberals. And I think this is the most important point. One of the things that I've seen over the last few years is an unwillingness of people on the center left in the United States to speak up against the woke out of fear that somehow they will be helping Republicans and Donald Trump. But I think it's the opposite. Social justice fundamentalism or the woke are a fundamental threat, particularly to the center left. They're essentially stifling freedom of thought and freedom of speech on the left. And in the long run, if they're allowed to prosper, they will destroy the center left because the only thing that will be left are the woke themselves. So I highly recommend, particularly if you're on the center left, read this book. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. It really helps the channel to grow. If you'd like more resources, I'd recommend going to my website, frompovertytoprogress.com. With a free email subscription, you get free ebook samples, free audio samples, and you can buy discounted ebooks and audiobooks. If you insist on paying full price, you can get ebooks, paperbacks, and hardcovers at Amazon, or if you're a bookstore or a library, you can get them at Inker and Spark. Audiobooks are available at Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. If you'd like to know more about books related to this content, I'd recommend going to my other website, which is the techratchet.com. It consists of an online library of over 280 book summaries on the topics of technology, history, economic growth, and progress. And now we're getting on to the exciting part, a free book giveaway of my first book, From Poverty to Progress. If you're a regular listener, you already know the rules. If you don't know the rules, please pause this video and read this description. There's a free book giveaway every week. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time.